The day I walked into that mansion, I thought I was being saved. But by nightfall, I wasn't sure if I'd walked into a home or a haunted house. The rain that morning came down in sheets, drenching the cracked walls of the orphanage until they looked like they were crying, too. I stood by the doorway, clutching a threadbare bag that held the sum of my life: 2 worn dresses and a photograph of a woman whose face I could barely remember. The matron's voice broke through the sound of the rain. "You're lucky, child," she said. "A wealthy man needs help in his house. You'll be safe there." Safe. I had heard that word before, but it never stayed true for long. The man who came to collect me didn't smile. His coat smelled of old books and cold air. He barely spoke during the ride, only one warning as we drove past fields swallowed by fog. "The master doesn't like questions. Do as you're told." When the car finally stopped, I saw it. The mansion. It stood on a hill, enormous and pale, its windows glimmering like eyes that had seen too much. The iron gate creaked open with a sound that felt alive, and I remember thinking the house was breathing, deep, slow, and heavy. The front door opened before I could knock. A woman stood there, tall and severe, her hair tied tight, her uniform black as midnight. She looked me up and down before speaking. "You'll sleep in the attic. No noise, no mistakes." Her voice carried the kind of finality that made my stomach twist. Inside, everything shone. Marble floors reflected my trembling hands. The smell of polish and roses filled the air, but it was too clean, too empty, like something was missing. Paintings hung on the walls, a family of 3, a man, a woman, and a girl about my age, smiling softly. But every frame was covered in dust except one, the girl's. Someone had cleaned it recently. That was when I saw him. The master. He was standing by the staircase, one hand resting on the banister, the other holding a book he never read. His face was calm, but his eyes weren't. They were the color of morning, distant, and searching for something that wasn't there anymore. He didn't look at me for long. "Work hard," he said quietly, "and stay away from the East Wing." Then he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing until they disappeared into the silence. I wanted to ask what was in the East Wing, but the maid's glare stopped me cold. So, I learned my duties instead: scrubbing floors, polishing silver, cleaning windows that reflected a stranger's face I barely recognized as mine. The house was filled with people, yet it felt utterly alone. That night, I climbed the narrow staircase to the attic. The light bulb flickered as I entered, the kind of flicker that makes you feel watched. My bed was nothing more than an old mattress, but it was dry, and that was enough. I told myself that maybe, just maybe, life would be better here. White's storm outside had grown wilder, but it wasn't the thunder that woke me later. It was a sound that didn't belong to the wind. A cry. Soft at first, like a whimper, then clearer. A child's cry. The kind that makes your chest tighten before you realize you're holding your breath. I sat up, my heart pounding in my ears. It was coming from downstairs, from the East Wing, the forbidden hallway. I waited, listening. The crying grew fainter, then stopped completely. For a moment, the silence felt heavier than the sound. I pulled the blanket to my chin, whispering to myself that it must have been a dream, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was grieving inside those walls. The next morning, I asked the kitchen maid if there were children in the house. She froze mid-step, her face turning pale. "Don't ask questions," she whispered. "We don't speak of the East Wing." Then she turned and left, her silence louder than any answer. That evening, as I was polishing the silverware, I caught sight of the master again. He stood by the window, staring toward the East Wing. The light caught his face, and for the briefest moment, I saw tears glisten in his eyes. He noticed me watching and turned away sharply. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "Go to bed." I nodded and hurried to the attic, my legs weak, my thoughts louder than the wind outside. That night I heard the crying again, closer this time. It wasn't coming from the east wing anymore. It was coming from the hallway, right outside my attic door. I froze, every part of me trembling. And then, a man's voice whispered through the dark, low, cracked, and haunting. "Don't cry again. Please." Every corner of that house whispered a name I didn't know. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. The voice outside my attic door had faded, but its echo stayed behind, like cold air trapped under my skin. When morning came, the sun pushed through the window, weak and pale, and for a moment I wondered if I had imagined it all. Maybe the storm had tricked me. Maybe my mind was still trying to find someone who cared enough to whisper in the dark. But when I opened the attic door, I froze. A faint wet footprint stained the wooden floor, right outside my room, leading away toward the east wing. At breakfast, no one mentioned the storm or the noises. The maids moved like ghosts through their routines, their faces dull, their words short. The head maid scolded me for being late, then ordered me to polish the silverware in the dining hall. I obeyed silently, my eyes scanning the walls. The same paintings, the same perfect stillness. Only one thing had changed. One of the family portraits now faced the wall, turned backward, as if the people inside had shamed the house. When the master entered, the air changed. He said nothing, just nodded for me to continue working. But something in his expression caught me. His hands trembled when he poured his tea. His eyes looked swollen, as though he hadn't slept either. The smell of the house began to haunt me. It wasn't unpleasant, just strange. A mix of lemon polish and wilted roses, the scent of something that had once been alive. I started to recognize it everywhere, on the curtains, in the hallways, even in the attic. It was as if the walls were trying to preserve memories that refused to die. Days passed, and I learned to move quietly. Every mistake earned me a glare or a whispered threat from the head maid. Once I dropped a teacup. The silence that followed was heavier than the sound of breaking porcelain. "If you can't handle the master's house," she hissed, "you can go back to the streets." I bowed, apologized, and swept the pieces with shaking hands. That night I cried quietly into my blanket, not from pain, but from exhaustion. The kind that comes when no one sees you, even when you're standing right there. The other servants rarely spoke to me, except when gossip slipped through their fear. "Don't go near the east wing," one whispered while peeling potatoes. "He lost something there, something he still talks to." "What did he lose?" I asked, my voice trembling. Her knife stopped mid-slice. "Don't ask," she murmured. "Some doors in this house open to the past." The more I tried to forget that warning, the louder the house seemed to breathe around me. The east wing hallway remained locked, but sometimes, late at night, I swore I heard faint humming from behind its doors. A soft tune that made the hairs on my neck rise. One evening, while dusting the living room, I caught a reflection in the window. The master was standing in the garden, looking up at the east wing windows, his lips moving soundlessly. He looked broken, not angry, not cruel, just hollow, like a man talking to ghosts he still hoped would answer. The next morning, he was different, cheerful, even gentle. He asked me if I was settling in well, if I liked working here. The sudden kindness unsettled me more than his silence ever did. "You remind me of someone," he said softly, then turned away before I could ask who. From that day, his moods changed like the weather, cold one moment, warm the next. Sometimes I would catch him staring at me too long, as if trying to remember something that was lost. Once, I thought I saw tears in his eyes again, but when I blinked, his face was calm, unreadable. The house began to feel alive, not with people, but with emotions. The walls groaned at night, the chandeliers swayed without wind, and the smell of roses grew stronger whenever I passed the east wing. I started keeping a candle beside my bed, afraid of the darkness that seemed to thicken after midnight. Still, I couldn't shake curiosity. What was behind those doors? Why did the master forbid us from going near them? One night, as the storm clouds gathered again, I woke to a faint creaking. Idle sound. The house was restless. I climbed out of bed and walked to the window. The moonlight fell weakly across the courtyard, pale, uncertain. And that's when I saw it. A flicker of light, faint but real, coming from the east wing window. My heart leapt into my throat. I stepped closer to the glass, my breath fogging the pain. There, movement. A shadow passing behind the curtain. Someone was in the locked wing. The candle on my nightstand suddenly went out. The air turned colder, thick with the scent of roses. I could still see the faint glow from the east wing window. And now, the shadow had stopped moving. It stood still, facing my direction, as if it knew I was watching. And then, the light inside went dark. I thought I was losing my mind when I saw my own face on the wall. After that night, I couldn't sleep anymore. The image of the east wing window, that flicker of light, that still shadow, haunted every blink, every breath. I told myself it had to be my imagination. But my heart knew the truth. Something was alive in that part of the house. Days passed in uneasy silence. The master barely spoke, though I caught him glancing at me sometimes. Quick, almost fearful glances that made me want to hide. The servants, too, had grown quieter. They whispered less and worked faster, as if the house itself was listening. One afternoon, the head maid sent everyone to the market except me. "You'll stay and clean the library," she ordered coldly. "Don't wander." Her words felt like a warning. The moment the last car rolled out of the driveway, silence swallowed the mansion whole. I could hear my own heartbeat echoing against the marble floors. That was when I noticed it. A faint hum of air coming from behind the staircase wall. A draft, maybe. Or a secret. I followed it. Slow steps. Light breath. Until I found myself standing before the east wing door. The one everyone said never opened. But today, it was slightly ajar. My fingers hesitated at the handle. Every sensible thought screamed, "Don't." But curiosity is a kind of hunger, too, and mine had been starving for answers. The door creaked as I pushed it open. A wave of air hit me, colder than the rest of the house, carrying the faint scent of old roses and burnt candles. The hallway was long, lined with faded wallpaper, and silent except for the faint hum of a clock somewhere deep inside. Each step I took stirred dust from the floor, making the air thick and heavy. The light was dim, barely enough to see. And then, there it was. A room at the end of the hall, the door half open as if inviting me in. Inside hung portraits, dozens of them. A woman, a man, a little girl. The same family from the dusty frames in the main hall. But these were untouched, preserved, as if frozen in time. And then I saw her. The girl in the largest portrait, standing in a white dress, smiling faintly, looked exactly like me. Not similar. Identical. My breath caught in my throat. I stepped closer, studying the painting. The curve of her lips, the small scar above her eyebrow, even the tilt of her head. Everything was mine. My knees weakened. My mind spun. Who was she? Why did she look like me? For a moment, I thought maybe it was some trick of light. But no, the resemblance was too perfect. I reached out and touched the frame, dust coating my fingertips like ash. That's when I heard voices. Two of them, muffled but close. I turned sharply, panic choking me. The sound came from behind a half-closed door nearby. I crept closer, careful not to make the floorboards creak. It was the master's voice, low, sorrowful. "I can't replace her," he said. "You know that." A woman's voice replied, the head maid, trembling but firm. "But she looks so much like—" "Enough," he snapped, then quieter. "No one replaces my daughter. No one. The words hit me like a stone to the chest. Daughter. My mind raced. The portraits, the resemblance, the forbidden wing. My body wanted to move, but fear pinned me to the floor. I backed away, trembling, my heart pounding so loud I thought they'd hear it. I shouldn't have come here. I had no right to breathe the air of their grief. I turned to leave, but my heel struck the corner of a table, sending a vase crashing to the ground. The shatter rang through the hall like a scream. My stomach dropped. I froze. My breath held hostage in my chest. Footsteps, heavy, fast, approaching. I darted behind a curtain, clutching the fabric so tightly my knuckles went white. The door to the room creaked open. I could hear the master's voice again, closer now, hard and controlled. "Who's there?" Silence. I didn't move. The air was thick with dust and dread. He stepped further in. I could see the shadow of his shoes through the gap at the bottom of the curtain. He stopped right in front of the painting, the one that looked like me. For a long moment he said nothing. Then I heard him whisper, brokenly, painfully, "Why do you still haunt me?" Tears stung my eyes. I didn't understand, but the sadness in his voice felt like a wound pressed against mine. He turned suddenly, his footsteps moving toward the door again. I thought he was leaving. Relief flooded through me, until I felt the curtain shift. He had stopped. I froze as the curtain moved slightly, brushing my cheek. A shadow loomed behind me, tall and silent. The air turned colder. I could hear his breath. Slowly I turned my head, and saw him standing there. His eyes met mine, wide, unblinking, as he whispered, "You shouldn't be here." When his voice dropped to a whisper, it was scarier than shouting. For a moment, neither of us moved. His eyes locked on mine, dark, wounded, furious, and I felt the blood drain from my face. The air between us felt sharp, like the house itself was holding its breath. "I asked you one thing," he said, voice low and shaking. "Just one." I wanted to speak, to explain, but my throat closed around the words. My heart pounded so loud I could barely hear myself think. He took a step closer, the faint light from the hallway cutting across his face, revealing exhaustion more than anger. "I told you never to enter this room," he said again, softer this time. But that softness hurt more. "Do you understand what you've done?" I nodded, my voice trembling. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean to." He raised a hand, not to strike, but to stop my words. His fingers shook. "Don't ever come here again," he said. "Ever." The way he said it, not with rage, but with despair, felt heavier than a scream. He turned his back to me and stared at the portrait on the wall, the girl who looked like me. His shoulders sank as though the weight of the world had found him again. "Go," he whispered. I ran. The door slammed behind me, echoing down the corridor like a sentence being passed. That night, I lay in the attic staring at the ceiling, my hands still trembling. Every word he'd said replayed in my head, each one heavier than the last. I wanted to believe I had just made a mistake, that he would forget. But deep down, I knew I'd crossed a line that couldn't be undone. For days, he didn't speak to me. When I passed him in the hallway, he looked through me, not at me. During dinner, his gaze stayed fixed on the empty chair beside him, the one that was never used. Even the other servants noticed the tension, their glances sharp and curious. The head maid stopped giving me orders. She just muttered, "You should have listened." The silence became my punishment, not the words, not the anger, the absence of it. I worked harder, longer, trying to prove I still belonged there, but the house seemed to turn colder each day, reflecting his distance in every corner. One evening, I stayed back after the others had gone to bed. The grand hallway gleamed under the dim light of the chandeliers. I knelt to scrub the marble floor, my arms aching, the brush scraping against stone like a heartbeat. I don't know what came over me, but as I scrubbed, tears began to fall. They mixed with the soapy water, forming tiny ripples that blurred my reflection. I kept scrubbing harder, not because the floor was dirty, but because I wanted to wash away the shame inside me. Maybe I reminded him too much of her, I thought. Maybe that's why he couldn't bear to look at me anymore. The echo of the brush against the floor became rhythmic, almost like prayer. Each stroke carried a silent apology for entering that room, for existing in a face that wasn't mine alone. When I finally stopped, I sat back, my knees sore, my hands raw. The floor shone brighter than before. A cruel irony. I had never felt smaller in my life. Days turned into weeks. I did my work quietly, never daring to meet his eyes again. But sometimes, I caught him, watching me from afar, not with anger, but with something far sadder. One evening, as I cleared the dining table, I noticed a small detail. The chair beside him had been pulled slightly out, as if someone invisible had been sitting there. My hands froze on the tray. When I looked up, his eyes were already on me. For a moment I thought he might say something. Instead, he just nodded slowly, a silent acknowledgement, and left the room. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind outside rattled the windows, and the smell of roses drifted faintly through the cracks in the attic ceiling. I pulled the blanket tighter, closing my eyes, but rest wouldn't come. The house was too quiet, too still. Then I heard it, a faint sound, muffled, breaking through the silence. A man's voice, low, broken. I sat up, heart pounding. It was coming from downstairs. It was him, through the walls, through the dark. I heard his voice, whispering her name. Not mine. Hers. The pain in his voice made my chest tighten. Each whisper sounded like it was pulled straight from his soul. I crept down the stairs, barefoot, drawn toward that sorrow. The closer I got, the clearer it became. He wasn't alone. Someone else was whispering back. It was my birthday, but I didn't even remember until the clock struck 12. That night, after hearing his voice echo through the corridors, low, aching, whispering another name, I lay awake until dawn. The silence that followed was heavier than the sound itself, as if the entire mansion had exhaled grief and refused to breathe again. When morning came, the light looked pale and reluctant, spilling weakly through the attic window like it didn't want to touch me. I felt hollow, almost transparent, like the house was slowly draining the color out of me. The day began like any other. Endless work, endless silence. I swept. I dusted. I washed dishes until my hands turned red, but no one looked at me. It was as though I had become part of the furniture, something useful, but unseen. Even the sound of my own footsteps seemed to fade faster now, swallowed by the house's cold rhythm. By noon, I found myself in the kitchen, scrubbing pots while the smell of roasted chicken and herbs filled the air. The cook, an older woman with tired eyes but a kind heart, hummed as she worked beside me. Her tune was soft, almost comforting, and for a moment I let myself drift into it, until she stopped suddenly and looked at me, her brow furrowed in thought. "You've been here nearly a year now, haven't you?" she asked. I nodded. "Almost." She smiled faintly, wiping her hands on her apron. "Then it must be soon. What was the date you came?" "October 17th, I said without thinking, and she froze. The spoon in her hand clattered onto the counter. "Child," she whispered, her voice softening. "That's today." I blinked at her, confused. "What?" She laughed gently, shaking her head. "It's your birthday, isn't it? Don't you know?" Her words hung in the air like a memory I had forgotten how to carry. My birthday, a date that meant nothing to anyone, not even me. At the orphanage, birthdays were quiet things, if they were noticed at all. I couldn't remember ever celebrating one. Couldn't remember anyone ever saying the words, "Happy birthday" to me. I forced a smile, trying to sound light. "It doesn't matter." But she looked at me a moment longer, as if she could see through the lie, before turning back to her work. It wasn't long before the others found out. One of the younger maids overheard, and by afternoon, whispers followed me everywhere I went. Not warm or kind ones, teasing, careless ones. "Poor thing," one said mockingly, "a birthday with no one to celebrate it." Another giggled, "Maybe the master will bake her a cake himself." Their laughter echoed down the hallways, sharp and cruel. I laughed too, or at least pretended to. That's what you do when you have no one to defend you. You laugh so people don't hear the breaking inside. The rest of the day passed slowly, painfully. The master didn't speak to me, didn't even look my way. I cleaned his study while he read, pretending not to notice the dark circles beneath his eyes, or the way his hands trembled slightly as he turned each page. I wanted to believe he was just tired, but deep down, I sensed something heavier gnawing at him. Guilt, maybe, or grief too deep to share. By the time the house grew quiet, my body ached from exhaustion. I climbed to the attic with numb steps, the wooden stairs creaking under my weight. The smell of rain lingered outside, mingling with the familiar scent of dust and solitude. I sat on my bed, looking out the small window at the moon half hidden by clouds, and whispered to myself, "Happy birthday." The words felt strange on my tongue, hollow and weightless. I tried to imagine what it would feel like if someone said them to me, if someone remembered me, if someone cared. But the thought hurt too much, so I pushed it away. The house was silent again, but a different kind of silence this time. The thick, expectant kind that comes before something happens. The wind brushed softly against the window pane. The clock downstairs ticked faintly, and my eyelids grew heavy. And then, a sound, a knock. Soft, careful, almost shy. My eyes snapped open. 3 taps against the attic door. I sat frozen, staring. No one ever came up here. No one even dared to climb those stairs. The knock came again. I rose slowly, my bare feet cold against the floorboards, my heartbeat echoing in my ears. "Who's there?" I whispered. No reply, only silence, thick and watchful. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob. I hesitated, then pulled the door open just a crack, and found no one there. Only the empty hallway. I stepped forward cautiously, my eyes adjusting to the dim light. That's when I saw it. A small box lying on the floor just outside my door. Plain, brown, tied with a thin red ribbon. There was no name, no card, no sound. I looked both ways down the hallway. Nothing but darkness. My fingers brushed the ribbon, and I felt a shiver run through me. The box was light. Too light, like it carried something invisible. For a moment I thought I heard breathing behind me, but when I turned, the hallway was empty. I took the box inside and placed it on the bed, staring at it under the flickering light. The ribbon seemed to tighten on its own, as if something inside was waiting to be opened. And then, from somewhere deep in the house, I heard the master's voice call softly. My name. Inside the box wasn't gold, but something far heavier. Truth. For a long time I just stared at it, the little brown box sitting on my bed like a question I wasn't ready to answer. The red ribbon shimmered faintly in the light, and I could feel the quiet pulse of the house around me. That same thick stillness that always seemed to follow the master's moods. My hands hesitated above the knot, afraid that whatever waited inside would change something I didn't even understand yet. But curiosity is cruel. It whispers that not knowing hurts more than knowing ever could. The ribbon slipped loose, and the paper tore with a soft sigh. Inside lay a velvet pouch, worn with age. The fabric darkened at the edges as if it had passed through too many hands. When I opened it, a single piece of jewelry fell into my palm. A delicate gold bracelet, its surface scratched and dulled by time. It wasn't the beauty that took my breath away. It was the engraving. 3 small letters carved inside the band. E-A-L. My heart stuttered. Those were my initials. For a moment I forgot how to breathe. I didn't own anything like this. I had never owned anything precious at all. At the orphanage, everything belonged to everyone. The bracelet was impossibly personal, as if it knew me before I knew myself. I turned it over and over in my trembling hands, searching for reason, for coincidence, for any explanation that didn't make the room tilt beneath me. But there was none. Who would send it? Why tonight? The master's voice from the night before echoed in my memory, that broken whisper calling my name through the dark. I wanted to believe it was kindness, that perhaps he had remembered my birthday, that this was a gesture of care. Yet deep in my chest, something colder stirred, a fear that maybe he was confusing me with the girl in the portrait, the one who looked exactly like me. Sleep never came. I sat by the window until dawn, the bracelet glinting weakly in the first light, the metal cold against my skin. When morning finally broke, I wrapped it carefully in a cloth and tucked it into my pocket. I needed to return it. Whatever this was, it wasn't mine to keep. The master was in the library when I found him, reading by the tall window, sunlight tracing the lines on his face. For a while, I stood silently at the doorway, unsure whether to interrupt. When he finally looked up, his expression softened just slightly, the kind of softness that still carried too much pain. "I believe this belongs to you, sir," I said quietly, stepping forward and placing the bracelet on the desk. He looked at it for a long time without touching it. Then, slowly, he shook his head. "No," he said. "It's yours. Mine." The word barely escaped my throat. "But how could it?" He interrupted, his gaze unfocused, voice low. "It was meant for someone who once brought light into this house. You should keep it." The way he said light made something inside me ache. I wanted to ask what he meant, to press for truth, but there was a finality in his tone that silenced me. I could feel the weight of unspoken words between us, too heavy to carry, too fragile to drop. He picked up the bracelet and slipped it gently around my wrist. His fingers brushed my skin only for a moment, yet that brief touch sent a tremor through me, not out of affection, but confusion, fear, and something else I couldn't name. "Keep it safe," he murmured. "It suits you." I nodded, though every part of me screamed that it wasn't right. The bracelet hung loosely, warm where his hands had been, cold everywhere else. That night I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror, the gold catching the light as I moved. It looked beautiful, yes, but it felt like a chain, a quiet reminder that I was part of something I didn't yet understand. The house grew restless again. Doors creaked. The air carried whispers that faded when I turned my head. At dinner, the servants exchanged glances but said nothing. Their eyes darted toward my wrist, then to each other, as if they knew something I didn't. The master was unusually quiet, lost in thought. Once he looked up and met my eyes, but the look wasn't for me. It was for someone else living inside my face. Later, as I cleared the dishes, I heard two of the maids talking near the kitchen. Their voices were low, trembling with gossip that sounded too close to fear. "I saw it," one said. "She's wearing it." "The bracelet?" "Yes. The one that disappeared after the accident." A pause, then a whisper that made my blood run cold. "He finally found her again." The plate in my hand slipped and shattered on the floor, but neither of them noticed. Their words echoed in my ears, each one heavier than the last. Found her again, as if I had once belonged here, as if I wasn't new at all. I looked down at the bracelet gleaming faintly against my skin and felt my pulse race beneath it. And for the first time, I wasn't sure who I really was anymore. That night, he didn't see me. He saw someone else through me. I knew it from the way his eyes changed, softening with a kind of sorrow that didn't belong to me. It was the look of a man remembering a ghost, not recognizing a person standing before him. And once again, I felt like a reflection living inside someone else's memory. The whispers from the kitchen wouldn't leave my head. He finally found her again. They looped in my mind, twisting around every thought, every heartbeat, until even silence carried their echo. I tried to convince myself that they meant nothing, that the bracelet was only an act of kindness, but the weight of it against my wrist made that lie impossible to hold. When evening came, I moved through the house like a shadow, doing my work without thought. The dining hall glowed with candlelight, the air thick with the scent of roasted herbs and quiet tension. The master sat at the head of the long table, his posture perfect, but his eyes distant, as if he were dining with ghosts instead of people. The servants moved with careful precision, their footsteps muffled by the carpet. No one dared to speak above a whisper. I kept my gaze low, refilling glasses and replacing plates, hoping he wouldn't notice me. But I could feel it, his eyes heavy and searching, following every move I made. When I reached his side to pour water into his glass, his voice broke the silence. "Thank you, Evelyn," he said softly. The glass slipped from my fingers before the word could settle. Water spilled across the tablecloth, seeping toward the edge, and the entire room froze. Every head turned toward me. Evelyn. That was the name carved inside the bracelet. I stood motionless, my heart pounding so violently I thought it might burst through my chest. He stared at me with that same distant look, not in anger, but confusion, as though he had spoken without realizing it. The cook cleared her throat nervously. "Sir," she whispered. "Her name is—" He blinked, as if waking from a dream. "Yes. Of course," he murmured. "My mistake." But his tone didn't sound like a mistake. It sounded like recognition. I nodded quickly, apologizing as I gathered the wet cloth, though my hands were shaking too much to hold it steady. The servants exchanged glances, the kind of looks that said more than words ever could. The head maid muttered something about carelessness, but her eyes weren't angry. They were frightened. Dinner resumed, but the silence that followed felt poisoned. I stood by the wall, pretending not to feel his gaze flicker toward me again and again. Every time our eyes met, he seemed to be studying me, measuring something I couldn't see. After the meal, I was told to clear the table alone. The others left quickly, almost running from the room. The master remained seated, staring at the empty chair beside him, the one that always stayed untouched. When I gathered the last of the plates, he finally spoke. "You remind me of her," he said quietly. My breath caught. "Who, sir?" He didn't answer right away. His eyes were far away, fixed on something only he could see. "My daughter," he said at last. "She would have been your age now." I froze, every piece of me trembling. I had expected anger, not sorrow. His voice carried no accusation, only the weight of love that had nowhere left to go. "I'm sorry," I whispered, unsure why I was apologizing. He looked at me then, really looked, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw tears forming in his eyes. "You even have her smile," he said, his voice barely more than a breath. "It's strange, isn't it? How time brings faces back to us, even when we thought we'd forgotten." I wanted to tell him that I wasn't her, that I couldn't be, but the words tangled in my throat. There was something fragile in him, something that felt like it would break if I spoke too loudly. He stood slowly, pushing his chair back, his hand resting on the table as if he needed its support. For a moment, he just stared at the chair beside him, the empty one. Then he turned to me. "Sit," he said. I blinked. "Sir, sit with me," he repeated, softer this time. "Just like old times." The room seemed to tilt, the chandeliers swaying faintly in the draft that wasn't there. My heart pounded so loud it drowned out everything else. He was still looking at me, not as his maid, not even as a stranger, but as someone he'd already lost. I hesitated, my feet rooted to the floor as his eyes pleaded with something I couldn't name. Every instinct told me to refuse, but his grief pulled at me like gravity. The candlelight flickered between us, shadows crossing his face, like fading memories. And then, in the trembling quiet, I heard him whisper again, not my name, but hers. Please. Sit, Evelyn. I shouldn't have gone back to that room, but something in me needed answers. It wasn't curiosity anymore. It was survival. A quiet desperation that whispered there was something about me I wasn't being told. Every time he called me Evelyn, it felt less like a mistake, and more like a memory he refused to bury. And I couldn't live another night wondering who I really was. The days that followed were suffocating. Ever since that night at the dining table, when he looked at me and saw someone else, the air in the mansion had grown heavier. The servants moved in silence, avoiding my eyes, whispering in corners like my presence had awakened something best left sleeping. The master barely spoke. When he did, his voice carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken things. He smiled once, a fragile, fleeting gesture. And I wished he hadn't, because it only made me see the sorrow behind it. But the real burden was the bracelet. Every time I looked at it, I saw those carved initials glowing faintly against my skin, like they belonged there. At night, when the house drifted into uneasy silence, I would trace the letters with my fingers, wondering what truth they were trying to tell me. One evening, I couldn't bear it anymore. The moon hung, low outside my window, pale and watchful, and I found myself standing in the hallway again, barefoot, trembling, but determined. The east wing door loomed at the end, like a boundary between who I was and who I had been. I hesitated only once before pushing it open. The room welcomed me with the same chill as before, the air stale and laced with the faint perfume of old roses. My candle flickered, its light bending across the walls as if afraid to settle. Dust floated in slow, deliberate circles, disturbed by the presence of a secret, too long kept. I moved past the portraits this time, their painted eyes following me like guardians of grief, until I reached the writing desk near the window. Papers were scattered there, brittle with age. Among them were sealed envelopes, their edges yellowed, tied together with a faded blue ribbon. My hands trembled as I untied it. The letters inside were written in delicate handwriting, the same signature repeating across the pages. Margaret L., the master's wife. Her words were addressed to him, but never sent. The ink had run in places, smudged by tears that must have fallen decades ago. She's too small to remember, but I can't forget the way she cried when they took her. They said it was safer, that we couldn't keep her after the fire. But I feel her absence like a wound that never closes. I read the line again and again, my heart hammering so violently I could barely breathe. Took her. Safer. After the fire. The words blurred before my eyes. My hand shook as I reached for another envelope, this one tucked beneath the rest. It wasn't a letter. It was a document. Adoption records. My vision swam. There, printed faintly beneath layers of dust, was my name. My full name, Evelyn Ann Lawton. The letters on my bracelet. The name he'd called me at dinner. The name I thought was a mistake. The air in the room shifted. I could feel it pressing against my chest, making it harder to breathe. Everything I'd believed about myself. The orphanage, the namelessness, the loneliness. It all felt like a lie someone had carefully built to keep the truth buried. I turned another page, desperate, trembling, until I found the final piece. A half-finished letter, the handwriting weaker, desperate. If you ever find her, tell her I'm sorry. Tell her we never stopped looking. Tell her the house still remembers her laughter. I pressed the paper to my chest, tears spilling down before I realized I was crying. The candlelight flickered wildly as the flame struggled to stay alive, and in its glow, I saw the walls differently, not as cold marble, but as a home that had once known warmth. The memories I didn't have suddenly felt real, a melody without lyrics, but familiar all the same. The way the master's eyes softened when he looked at me, the portrait of the girl who looked like me, the box on my birthday. It all made sense now, horrifyingly, heartbreakingly so. I stumbled backward, clutching the bracelet as if it could anchor me. My reflection shimmered faintly in the glass frame of the portrait, my face overlapping hers, merging, indistinguishable. For the first time in my life, I wasn't sure where I ended, and she began. A sound broke through the stillness, the soft creak of the floorboards behind me. My candle trembled, the flame stretching toward the noise as if drawn by breath. I turned slowly, my pulse pounding in my ears. The doorway stood open, framed by shadows. He was standing there, the master, silent, unmoving, the light catching the photograph in his hand. His eyes met mine, not with anger this time, but something far more terrifying: recognition. The photograph slipped from his fingers and drifted to the floor between us. Even from where I stood, I could see it clearly. A baby in his arms, wearing the same bracelet I had on my wrist. And in that instant, the truth I had been chasing finally turned to ice inside my veins. He didn't shout this time. He just cried. And somehow that was worse, because when a man like him breaks, the whole world inside him collapses with the sound of silence. I had seen him angry, distant, haunted, but I had never seen him human until that night. And once I did, I couldn't hate him anymore. The photograph lay between us, its edges curling slightly from age, the candlelight trembling across its surface. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, only stare at the baby in his arms, the faint smile frozen in time, the same gold bracelet glinting faintly around her tiny wrist. He stepped closer, the wooden floor groaning under his weight, and for a moment I thought he would raise his voice, demand answers, and accuse me of trespassing again. But instead he bent down, picked up the photograph with shaking hands, and whispered, "I never thought I'd see that face again." His voice cracked mid-sentence, breaking something deep inside me. The man who had once seemed carved from stone now looked older, smaller, fragile. He turned the photograph over, tracing the date written in faded ink. "That day," he said, "was the last time I saw her alive." My throat tightened. "Your daughter?" He nodded slowly, his eyes glistening with tears that refused to fall. "Evelyn, my little girl." He gave a hollow laugh, one that held no joy. "She was 5 when the fire took her. They told me it was quick, merciful. But I've never believed mercy exists in flames." He walked toward the window, the moonlight outlining his silhouette against the glass. "After that night, I lost everything. My wife, my faith, myself. The house became a tomb, filled with echoes and dust." His hand trembled as he set the photo on the desk. "And then you arrived." I stayed silent, the weight of his confession sinking into me like a stone into still water. "When I first saw you," he continued, "I thought grief was playing tricks on me. You looked so much like her. Too much. Every glance felt like seeing a ghost I couldn't bury. That's why I was cruel, distant. It wasn't you I feared. It was what you reminded me of." Tears blurred my vision, spilling freely before I could stop them. "I didn't mean to hurt you," I whispered. He turned to me then, his eyes filled not with pain, but remorse. "You didn't," he said. "You woke up something I thought I'd lost forever." He came closer, the air between us thick with years of silence breaking. His hand lifted slightly, hesitated, then rested gently on my shoulder, not with authority, but with trembling tenderness. "You are not her," he said softly. "But somehow, being near you makes it hurt less." The warmth of his hand felt like forgiveness and apology intertwined. For a moment, the mansion no longer felt haunted. It felt alive again, breathing, healing. Days passed differently after that night. The cold distance between us began to melt, replaced by small, fragile gestures of care. He started asking about my day, my work, my life before this house. I told him fragments, the orphanage, the loneliness, the dreams that never survived past morning. He listened quietly, sometimes smiling, sometimes looking away, when the memories became too heavy. The servants noticed the change. The whispers stopped carrying fear and started carrying wonder. The master was speaking again. The house itself seemed to shift, lighter, warmer, as though it too had been waiting for this fragile peace. He began to treat me like something precious, not a maid, not a replacement, but a person. One evening, he surprised me by asking me to sit with him in the garden, under the withered rose arch that had been untouched since the fire. The moonlight fell between us like a fragile thread connecting two lonely hearts. "She used to love this place," he said, looking toward the dead roses. "Every spring she'd run here and talk to the flowers as if they could hear her. Margaret said she got that from me." His voice cracked again, but this time it wasn't pain. It was memory, raw and real. We sat in silence for a long time. The world outside the mansion didn't matter. For the first time, it felt like home. Not the kind with walls and locks, but the kind made of shared sadness and quiet understanding. He started leaving small gestures of kindness, a book on my table, a blanket folded neatly on cold nights, a word of thanks after dinner. And I, in return, began to see him differently, not as a master, not even as a stranger, but as a man trying to rebuild his soul from the ashes of loss. For a while, I allowed myself to believe this peace could last, that the shadows of the past had finally settled, that maybe, just maybe, I had found where I belonged. But fate is cruel when it gives comfort to those it intends to test again. It happened one evening as I was setting the dining table. The clock had just struck 8 when the phone in the hallway rang, a sound so ordinary it shouldn't have felt ominous, yet somehow it did. The servants froze. No one ever called this late. The master rose slowly and answered, his voice steady at first. "Yes, this is Mr. Loughton." Then came silence, long, tense, stretching across the room until I could hear nothing but the pounding of my own heart. His face paled as he listened. When he finally spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper. "Who did you say you were?" He turned toward me, the receiver trembling in his hand. For a moment he said nothing, just stared at me as though the ground beneath us had shifted. Then, quietly, he repeated the words he'd just heard. "They say, they know who your real parents are." The phone slipped from his grasp, clattering against the floor, and in that instant, the fragile peace we had built shattered like glass underfoot. There are sounds that never belong to peace. One of them is a telephone ringing in a house that has forgotten how to breathe. That single ring carved through the quiet like a blade, and before the second followed, I already knew it was meant for me. Fate doesn't knock, it calls, and when you answer, it rearranges everything you thought was certain. I didn't realize that night that I was about to walk willingly into another lie, dressed in the clothes of truth. The master lifted the receiver with hands that trembled as though the air itself had turned heavier. The rest of us froze, waiting, watching the color drain from his face as he listened. "Yes," he said quietly, his eyes flicking toward me. "She's here." Then a silence so long that even the clocks seemed afraid to tick. When he finally spoke again, his voice was nothing more than a breath. "They say they know who your parents are." The words broke something invisible between us. The phone fell from his hand and struck the floor with a hollow thud that echoed down the corridor. For the first time since I had met him, he looked truly afraid, not for himself, but for me. "They'll send proof," he whispered, and then walked away, before I could ask what he meant. That night, the house didn't sleep. Every door seemed to shift on its hinges, every candle guttered as though restless with secrets. By morning, a letter had appeared beneath the front door, sealed in plain wax, my name scrawled across it in unfamiliar writing. Inside was a short note and an address written with deliberate care. "We've been searching for you since the fire. Come home." My heart beat so fast, it hurt. The orphanage had never spoken of any family. No one had ever looked for me. I should have been cautious, but hunger for belonging is stronger than fear. The master asked me to let him go in my place, but I refused. If they're truly mine, I need to see them, I said. His eyes softened with sorrow that felt almost paternal. Be careful, child, he murmured. Sometimes, the past lies louder than strangers ever could. I carried those words with me as I left the only place that had ever offered me a name. The road to the city shimmered with heat and dust, yet I felt cold all over. Every mile felt like a question I couldn't answer. When I reached the address, evening had settled. A row of narrow houses leaning against one another, the windows blind with grime. A woman opened the door before I could knock. She smiled with a tenderness that looked rehearsed. "Evelyn," she said, her voice trembling as though from emotion. "You're home." Inside, two men waited by a small table. The air smelled faintly of metal and mold. Photographs were scattered before them, blurred images of a child with my face standing beside people whose features melted into light. "You were taken from us after the fire," one said. "Your inheritance was never claimed. Sign these papers and everything that belonged to you will return." The word inheritance glowed like a promise. I wanted to believe them. I wanted to believe anything. But when the woman poured tea, her sleeve slid back, and I saw the glint of gold on her wrist. A bracelet identical to mine, except the inside was smooth, unmarked. My breath faltered. Something in her smile hardened. I stood slowly. "Where did you get that?" I asked. Her eyes lost all warmth. "Sit down, Evelyn. You don't understand what's best for you." "I do," I said. "It isn't this." I turned toward the door. One of the men blocked the way, his tone now stripped of gentleness. "You should have stayed in that mansion. You were safer there." The room closed in, the air thick with deceit. Panic flooded me. I shoved past him, the chair crashing to the floor, and ran. Rain met me on the street, sudden and blinding. My shoes slipped. My breath tore at my throat, the city spinning into a blur of gray and gold. I didn't stop until the sound of pursuit faded into the distance. When I finally looked down, my bracelet was gone. My pockets were empty. They had taken everything, the money, the papers, even the piece of proof I never asked for. I had come looking for a family and found only thieves dressed in memory. For 3 nights I wandered, sleeping beneath doorways, my thoughts circling the mansion like a prayer. Shame burned deeper than hunger. I had traded safety for ghosts. On the 4th evening, as the sun bled out behind the rooftops, a boy in a tattered cap approached. "Miss Evelyn?" he asked politely. I nodded, too tired to speak. He handed me an envelope sealed with dark wax, the crest pressed into it unmistakable, the emblem of the Loughton estate. I tore it open, my fingers trembling so badly that the paper nearly slipped away. Inside was a single page, written in the master's hand, the ink still fresh, as though he had finished writing moments before the messenger left. "You don't have to keep running. The house still remembers you. The roses have bloomed again. Come home on your birthday. The door will be open." The letter blurred as tears filled my eyes, the words glowing faintly beneath the streetlight. The noise of the city faded until only my heartbeat remained. Steady, waiting. Home. The word had once meant nothing, but now it sounded like forgiveness wrapped in danger. I pressed the paper to my chest and closed my eyes, feeling the pull of that mansion across the miles. Whatever waited for me there, truth or another lie, I knew I was going back. The moment I stepped back into that mansion, everything felt different, warmer, alive, as though the walls themselves had been waiting for me to return. The wind that used to moan through the corridors now carried laughter, soft and uncertain, like someone learning how to smile again. Even the air smelled changed, filled not with dust and silence, but with roses freshly opened, their scent whispering welcome. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like a visitor stepping into someone else's story. I felt like a missing page finally slid back into its book. I reached the gate on the morning of my birthday. The same iron gate that once groaned like a warning. This time it opened before I touched it, the hinges singing instead of screaming. The path that had once been littered with dry leaves was swept clean, the stones polished to a quiet shimmer. As I walked toward the door, I could hear faint music drifting through the windows, gentle notes that rose and fell like memories trying to dance again. My hands shook when I lifted the knocker. Before I could use it, the door swung open. The head maid stood there, her face softer than I had ever seen it. For a moment she said nothing, only looked at me as though confirming I was real. Then she smiled, awkwardly, shyly, and whispered, "Welcome home, Miss Evelyn." Inside, light spilled across the marble floor in golden sheets. Streamers of ribbon hung from the banisters. Vases of crimson roses lined the hallway. The mansion, once gray and hollow, glowed with color and breath. I stood in the middle of it all, trembling with disbelief, afraid that blinking would make it vanish. Then he appeared at the end of the hall. The master, no, the man who had once been my master, walked slowly toward me, his steps measured, his expression unreadable. But when he spoke, his voice carried the gentleness of someone who had finally forgiven both himself and the past. "You came," he said. "I didn't think I would," I answered honestly. "But your letter?" He nodded. I meant every word. He led me toward the dining room, and when I entered, my breath caught. The table that had always been long and cold now glimmered with candles, each flame reflected in the crystal glasses like tiny suns. A cake sat in the center, delicate and pale, with my name written in careful icing. Around it stood the servants, not stiff or silent as before, but smiling, waiting, their eyes warm with something close to affection. I turned toward him, unable to speak. He gestured for me to sit. The chair beside him pulled out as though it had been waiting years for me to fill it. "This house forgot how to celebrate," he said softly, "until you walked through it." I wanted to ask why, to understand what this day meant beyond candles and sweetness, but he raised his hand slightly. "Before you ask," he said, "there's something I need to show you." He walked to the sideboard and picked up a thin leather file tied with a red ribbon, the same color as the ribbon that once bound the box I found on my birthday. My pulse quickened as he untied it and drew out several papers. The room seemed to still, the music fading into silence. He looked at me for a long time before he spoke. "The night you left," he said, "I realized I couldn't lose you the way I lost her. I had already begun the process long before, the papers, the signatures. But I never told you, because I wanted you to choose to stay, not to feel trapped." He handed me the top page. My eyes scanned the words slowly, afraid to believe what I was reading. Adoption certificate. My name, Evelyn Ann Loughton, his signature below it, dated weeks before I had ever stepped beyond those gates. "I filed it after your first birthday here," he continued, his voice breaking. "You were already mine in every way that mattered. I just hadn't told you yet." Tears blurred the ink as I clutched the paper. The years of silence, the coldness, the distance, all of it shifted in an instant, revealing the truth hidden beneath. Love that had been there all along, too wounded to speak. The servants began to clap softly, unsure if they were intruding on something sacred. The sound came to me faintly, like waves in another world. I looked up and found him watching me, eyes glistening, waiting for something, maybe forgiveness, maybe understanding. All I could manage was a whisper. "Why me?" He smiled, and in that smile was the man he might have been before grief hollowed him. "Because you brought life back to this place," he said. "Because when I looked at you, I saw not the ghost I had lost, but the daughter I was meant to find." I covered my face with my hands, overwhelmed by the weight of it. Around me, the room blurred into light and sound, music swelling, candles flickering, voices soft and kind. For the first time, the mansion felt alive, not as a monument to sorrow, but as a home reborn. As the evening deepened, laughter spilled freely, blending with the gentle music that once only haunted the halls. I could almost hear the echoes of my younger self running through the corridors, chasing sunlight instead of shadows. Then, as the last candle burned lower and the guests fell quiet, he stood once more, holding the certificate against his chest. The flickering flame painted gold across his weary face, and when he spoke, the tremor in his voice carried years of longing turned finally into peace. He stepped closer until I could see the tears trembling on his lashes. The room went silent, the only sound the heartbeat I could hear between us. He looked at me, not as the girl who served him, not as a memory returned, but as something whole and real. And then, with a voice that cracked under its own love, he said, "You were never my maid. You were my daughter all along." The world held its breath, and for a moment, even time forgot to move. For years, I cleaned his floors, never knowing I was walking on my own home. Every step I took through those halls carried the sound of a heart searching for belonging. I had believed I was invisible, but the truth was that I had been seen all along, even when love hid behind silence. And now, standing beneath the same roof that once felt like a stranger, I finally understood what it meant to be found. The words, "You were never my maid. You were my daughter all along," still echoed inside me like a prayer I never dared to ask for. The man I once feared now stood before me as something far greater than a master. He was family, the kind that grief had almost stolen from both of us. The tears I'd held back for years came freely, not of pain this time, but of release. Every moment of hunger, every lonely night, every unanswered question, it all led to this truth, radiant and fragile, resting between us. He smiled through his own tears, and for the first time, his eyes carried light instead of loss. "You brought life back to this house," he said quietly. "And in doing so, you brought life back to me." The mansion seemed to breathe again. The walls that once trapped sorrow now echoed laughter. The servants, who had always spoken in whispers, smiled openly. Even the roses in the garden bloomed brighter, as though they too had been waiting for forgiveness. That night, a celebration filled the dining hall. Candles flickering, glasses clinking, music rising gently like the voice of the house itself. I sat beside him, no longer at the corner of the table, no longer hidden behind duty. Every look, every smile from those around me felt like the world had finally decided I was enough. When he raised a toast, his voice shook with emotion. "To the daughter I lost, and the daughter I found," he said. And though his words were simple, they carried more love than I had ever known in my life. Later, he led me to the East Wing, the place I had once feared. The door, once locked and forbidden, stood open, bathed in soft golden light. Inside, the portrait of the little girl remained, her smile eternal, her eyes kind. Beneath it, a new plaque gleamed. Evelyn Ann Lawton. My name. My story rewritten on the walls of a home that had always been mine. I touched the frame gently, feeling as though her laughter still lingered in the air. In the weeks that followed, peace returned to the house. I helped him rebuild the orphanage, taught the children whose eyes mirrored my old loneliness, and realized that kindness, quiet, patient kindness, has the power to rewrite destinies. I was no longer the girl who worked unseen. I was part of something larger, a family made not by blood, but by grace. One morning, as sunlight poured through my window, I found a small box on my bedside table, plain brown, tied with a red ribbon. My breath caught. Inside was my old bracelet, polished and whole again. No note, no signature, just silence that said more than words ever could. I smiled through my tears, knowing he must have placed it there, his way of saying everything without speaking at all. The house no longer mourned. It lived. The sound of children's laughter replaced the cries that once haunted its halls, and in every reflection, I saw not the orphan I had been, but the daughter I had become. Yet, as peace settled softly around me, one thought refused to leave, a single thread of mystery woven through the fabric of my joy. Sometimes, when the night turns quiet and the roses tremble beneath the moonlight, I still think of that first box left outside my door. No one ever confessed to placing it there. He swore it wasn't him, and the servants never spoke of it again. But I've come to believe that some kindness comes from places we'll never see. And still, in the silence, I sometimes wonder, who left that box at my door that night? If this story touched your heart, then don't leave just yet, because every story I tell hides another truth waiting to be found. Subscribe and stay with me, because next time, one small act of kindness will turn into a fate you'll never forget. Leave your thoughts below. Tell me, what do you think was really inside that first box? And remember, sometimes the quietest stories hold the loudest secrets.